My name is Martin Madert with the Witness to War Foundation, and the following interview is part of the United States Marine Corps Vietnam Tankers Association History Project. The interview is being conducted at the VTA reunion in St. Louis, Missouri on September 24, 2017. Interviewees are members of the VTA. The purpose of the History Project and the interviews is to capture the experiences of our Vietnam veterans and make them available for future generations.
My name is Bolick. I was in Charlie Company, 1st Tank Battalion, 2nd Platoon, in Vietnam from 1969 to 1970.
And we could start off with the experience that you were looking to share today.
Probably the most memorable experience dealt with leadership. There was a renowned Marine major in there by the name of Gene Duncan. Most Marines of my ilk recognize that name. He was the headquarters commandant at 1st Tank Battalion in the latter part of 1969. I had just finished my tour as a platoon commander with 2nd Platoon Charlie Company and was back at the battalion CP as the intelligence officer, which is a misnomer because I was definitely not the intelligence person, but young lieutenant intelligence officer for the battalion. And we had an incident in one of the villages outside our cantonment and had gone out and investigated it. The incident reportedly was some torture done on children in the area by what was presumed to be VC to get information or get them to support or whatever. And so my interpreters and I went down and we interviewed the people in the village and came to the conclusion that what had happened is the children had picked up some very colorful rubber bands, worn them on their arms, over time had created lacerated parts in their elbows, which had been reported as being VC torture of the children. So I went back and made my report, said no VC activity in that area, and proceeded to ignore the rest of it. And so I went to chow breakfast that morning, and Major Duncan walked past me and said, "Lieutenant, I'd like to see you in my office when you're through." You know, that's not unusual. He was the headquarters commandant. So after breakfast, I went over and reported to him, and I have never been chewed out any better or any worse by any individual. And I'm a lieutenant, he's a major, he's a seasoned major. I mean, he's a Korean War veteran. He had served with the ARVN for a while. So, I mean, he had a reputation, and to not meet his expectation was kind of a career ending for a Marine, you would think. So I left in shock and went back to my office and talked to my interpreters and said, "What did we miss here? You know, there's something wrong with this situation." And they said, "No, we were absolutely correct in what we did." So I, say, well, my career is over, but I'll finish my tour here. The next morning, I was at breakfast, and Major Duncan walks by and says, "Lieutenant, I'd like to see you in my office." And I said, "Okay, there's nothing happened overnight, so I don't know what this one's about." So I report to him, and I'm ready for another, whatever happens, and he apologizes. He says, "Lieutenant Bolick, I was sorry. I misjudged the situation. I was ahead of, I just didn't have all the facts, and I apologize for the experience that we went through yesterday." And again, shock, but a different kind of shock. I'm a lieutenant, and a senior officer by a couple of grades has apologized for something that he could have ignored. I mean, it just made an impression on me, and throughout my 27 years of active duty, that stuck with me, that a senior officer must have the wherewithal to recognize when they make a mistake and apologize. And I had seen Gene Duncan on a number of occasions. Every time I saw him, I reminded him of that event and how that mentorship situation was left with me. So again, Vietnam has a lot of meanings to people. This was a combat situation, but that lasted with me for a long time.
Tell me about some of the men that you served with, as peers.
The types of Marines we had there ranged from normal high school graduate to high school dropouts to people who had been given their opportunity to either go to jail or go to the Marine Corps. My personal experience, my crew on a tank consisted of a corporal who was the gunner by the name of McKnight, and he was a sharp individual, and he could operate the tank, the gunnery part of the tank very well. My driver was a guy whose last name was Gonzalez. My loader was a high school dropout, red-headed, freckle-faced, lanky kid, Logan. And in one event that stands out in my mind, we were in a firefight in an operation. The 90 millimeter gun misfired. The coax machine gun, 30 caliber, misfired. The 50 caliber didn't work. And so McKnight dropped the breech, which is about a 90-pound block of iron that you have to chain down and then replace the percussion mechanism. He did this, again, while we were in a firefight, and Logan took the 30 caliber machine gun, and the tank is a very small place. You can't do a lot of things in there, but they both did this simultaneously. And the driver kept us moving so we were not a stationary target. And I fired my .45 and my M16 off the top just to make sure they thought we were still able to shoot at things. But that's the type of crew you have. You have a mixture that came together and worked as a harmonious unit. And it was, for a young officer, it made a lasting impression on the quality of the individual. When pressure happens, you have these people that come forward.
Did you have any funny stories from your time in Vietnam?
Oh, yeah. We were, again, on another operation with the infantry, and I apologize ahead of time for my infantry brethren, but I was wearing a flak jacket and a t-shirt, no rank insignia or anything. I was in the cupola of the tank, and we had stopped for a moment, and the infantry we were supporting, the lieutenant came up to me and said, do you know where we are? And I said, well, there's a stream bed over here. And I said, on my map, it looks like we're right about here. And he had gotten up on top of the tank, and he said, well, I don't think, that doesn't seem right. Let's check your compass. And I said, compass? And he said, yeah, that thing down there, down in your tank there, that round thing, it's got a compass. I said, no, that's an azimuth indicator. I can make it say anything I want it to do. It's not a magnetic compass. It shows nothing about where we are. That's where my gun tube points. And he said, oh, that's a compass. I said, no, it's an azimuth indicator. So he then brings out his compass and puts it down on top of my tank, and this thing starts spinning around because he's on a metal surface. And he throws it, he puts it in his pocket, and he asks his gunny for another compass because he says his is broken. And I said, don't put it on the tank or it'll be broken again. And he got off, mumbled and grumbled and everything else. But again, it's one of these things where we didn't always communicate well with each other, and we didn't understand how each other operates. And in some cases, we think we know more than we do.
Tell me about the food situation out there. I've heard a lot of stories about different sorts of rations.
Tanks were different than the infantry because we could carry more. I mean, we could, for example, we had what they called a Mormite can, which was nothing more than an insulated box that you could put, if you could get ice, you could put ice in it and you could keep things cool. Well, the gunner usually sat on a Mormite can inside the vehicle with sodas or whatever he needed, whatever we had access to there. As far as the food goes, we had sea rations. The highlight was to try to get near an Army unit and get what they call the long rations, which were now the predecessors of MREs. They were in bags instead of cans. But I think the most memorable time was one time we were operating in our area, and my platoon sergeant was a guy by the name of Staff Sergeant Paul Sublette. Terrific platoon sergeant, one that every young lieutenant aspires to have because they, teach you everything. But we had a goulash where everybody took their C rations and dumped it into a thing, and we had not a bonfire, but a heated surface. And it was probably the best meal we'd had because the C rations in and of themselves were not that palatable.
Which rations were most popular? Which ones did you try and avoid?
Well, I guess the ham and lima beans were always the ones that no one really wanted. Spaghetti wasn't that bad. It's hard to remember which one I liked the most. It was, whichever one you came up with. I think what you would go for was the one that had the best dessert, the best fruit or the best cake, or pound cake to me was the best, or the fruit cocktail. I think Amtrackers avoid apricots, and tankers kind of don't necessarily go along with apricots. I don't like apricots anyway, so. But I'd say the pound cake and maybe the spaghetti.
Kind of want to take it back to combat a little bit. Talk about the enemy forces out there. Were they primarily NVA or VC at this time?
We operated, as tankers, you stay kind of on the road as much as you can. The one operation, Pipestone Canyon, which was in Dodge City and Genoa Island, it was mainly VC. Some of the CPs or command posts that we encountered, that the infantry encountered, we never got off and got in them, but they would find rice heated, that they had gotten them pretty quickly. To my knowledge, they were mainly VC. We didn't have the hard-nosed NVA that were up in the mountains and places like that. The infiltrators, like my last operation with platoon was on LZ Ross in the Quezon Mountains, or the valley of Quezon, and they were VC that attacked and overran the organization there, and had overrun the Army before us. So it primarily VC, and they, they looked like an average Vietnamese. That was one of the hard things, is to tell the difference between the friendly and the enemy. They weren't in uniform. The NVA were, but the VC, black pajamas and a straw hat, and when you killed one or saw them, you knew who they were because they had weapons on them and things like that. But that's about the only discriminator.
And what sort of tactics were they utilized against you and the other tankers?
Mines were some of the things they liked to do. Fortunately, my platoon, we only hit small anti-personnel mines on road sweeps. The platoon that took my place on LZ Ross, however, made a resupply run into the valley where the Marines were needing the infantry was needing some resupplies, took some Amtracks, and the tanks led them in and brought them out. But it was one road in, it was muddy, and so you couldn't turn around. You just went in and then you reversed your motion out. That was basically it. So for some unexplained reason, they were able to go all the way down the road. And then when they came back, again, unexplained tactical situation, the last tank out was the platoon commander's tank, and it hit a 250-pound bomb that had been buried, and it destroyed the tank. It killed the driver and the gunner immediately. The loader, the lieutenant was riding as the loader, and he would have died had it not been for the quick action of the Amtrackers who pulled him out, and he was burned all over his body because of the white phosphorus. The tank commander, the sergeant that was riding as tank commander, was blown out of the tank. So the 2 out of 4 survived. And so the tactics they used were pretty much roadside bomb. I mean, it's the same thing you're seeing in Iraq and Afghanistan, only they're different. We had IEDs a long time before IEDs became popular. And other than that, they would attack a cantonment, and they would sneak through the wire. I mean, they were experts at getting through the wire. And there were a lot of problems because you had to have permission to shoot if you were in a static position, and you had to have somebody come down and confirm that what you were about to shoot at is not an animal or not a friendly or something. And it was really, really frustrating for the infantry mainly. We were in support of infantry, so in tanks, if we were in operation, we didn't get permission to shoot. We were really there to be shooting at things, so it was a different thing. I was glad I was in tanks because I sort of control my own destiny that way.
Do you know if the 2 that survived made it past the hospital?
Yes, Lieutenant Mitchell, I went to see him at the Dang at the hospital, burned all over. He survived. I honestly do not know anything after he left the Marine Corps. And the other one, I think his name was Ortiz, he had a broken hip. So yeah, they survived. The other 2 certainly didn't. But they, again, we didn't lose anyone in my platoon while I was there. But we didn't have, we were not as engaged as some of the infantry guys, as many of the infantry guys, and as some of the 3rd tanks up in the northern part of the country. But we saw our share and enough to appreciate the fact that we liked having steel around us.
Did you keep much correspondence with your family back home?
Yes, I got letters pretty regularly from home, and tried to write back frequently. My parents were living in Germany at the time, so the time distance was even longer than it would be to the States. And I got letters from my cousins. We did get care packages. I just remembered this. There was a lady in California who got her school to send us care packages. And so when I returned from Vietnam, I made a point to stop by and thank them for what they had done. And I mean, they adopted the platoon. They really kept us in cookies and things. And again, that support was very appreciative.
Tell me about your experience coming back to the States and back to the world. What was that like?
Well, that's something I've wrestled with. People will ask you, did you suffer from PTSD, and how do you avoid that, or whatever. And I came to the conclusion, I came back by ship. When I was getting close to my rotation tour date, I was given an option. You can wait till your RTD and fly out on that day, or you can leave, a few days early, go back by ship. You'll get back later, but you'll leave the country sooner. Well, I was about to decide to stay with the RTD and go by air, and we got a rocket attack. We were right in line with the airfield where our battalion was, and occasionally a short round will land in our place. And one landed very close to where we were staying, and that was kind of a premonition to me to say, get on the ship. So we came back by ship. Well, that was 10 or 12 days to decompress. And we landed at Camp Pendleton, offloaded there. Did not experience the San Francisco or Los Angeles, spitting on your whatever. That was to come later, but the decompression, I think, is what it was. And if you think about World War II, most of the troops came back by ship, and they had time to unwind. And so when they got off the ship, they weren't sensitive to backfiring cars, that you sound like a weapon. And I really believe that had a lot to do with not experiencing, one, I didn't have to go through the airport and experience that, and two, you unwound a lot, and so you were not quite as sensitive to the backfiring cars and that sort of stuff.
I think there's also something you said about the average time in combat you guys were in versus the average time in combat someone in the European theater
Yeah.
or the Pacific theater.
Oh, but big difference. I mean, when you went to war in World War II, you were there for the duration, and you fought from Africa to Europe and into Germany, and those guys, Greatest Generation is a name that they got, and it wasn't for no reason. And the other thing in Vietnam that's different than today is they were individual replacements. You know, a guy shows up in a platoon, and he's the newbie, and people are a little, you know, reticent of him. The way I understand they're doing it today is it's unit rotation. So a unit goes into Afghanistan, a unit comes back. Yes, if somebody's killed or wounded, there might be individual replacement, but that unit integrity is there, which we didn't necessarily see in Vietnam.
And I'm glad you bring that up because, you know, working tankers, it's like a well-oiled machine. Everyone's got their role. Tell me about bringing in new guys into the fold and bringing them up to speed.
We, I think, only received one. We got maybe 2 new guys. One of them came with a lot of baggage and ended up having to have a humanitarian transfer. Issues at home that he never should have come over there at that situation. But a new guy coming in, simply, again, a crew is 4 people. So it's not like a platoon of infantry guys where one guy is, you know, 1 out of 50 or so. You're 1 out of 4, you can't be a standout. So usually the tank, no, always the tank commander's responsibility was to bring the guy in and make sure he is trained. Now, if he came in a tank unit, the junior guy is the loader, the senior guy on the tank is the tank commander, the next guy is the gunner, and the next one is the driver. So if he's a junior guy, like a PFC, then he's going to come in and probably take the loader's position. But again, if the loader's not the one that migrated, whoever left, somebody's got to move up and fill. Like if the gunner left, the driver may end up coming back to be the gunner, because they're all 1811s at that time. They all were school trained in what they did, so they just pick it up. Regardless of rank, they may have to move up to a position. So again, limited experience at bringing the new ones in. We did bring a new platoon sergeant in, and that was a different, that was at the very end of my tour. That's hard, especially if you've had a bonding and the senior NCO it takes time for that new NCO, staff NCO, to really, you know, warm to or have them warm to him, even though he is the senior enlisted man. It takes a special person to do that. Now, I wasn't there long enough to see whether my new platoon sergeant fit in and did that, but it was hard to replace the one. Sublette was, in my mind, irreplaceable for a young lieutenant to have a staff NCO like that.
Well, a few other questions to wrap us up today. What do you want future generations to remember about the Vietnam War?
Well, my daughter asked me this a couple times. It wasn't a lost war. Because of my experience as the intelligence officer, I got to see in fact, my Vietnamese interpreters, one was originally from Saigon and one's from Hanoi. So I was able to hear both sides, or 2 sides of the situation. I really believe that we were there for the right reason. We were there to try to allow South Vietnam to make their own decision and to, in our minds, stay free. Whereas the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong were trying to overthrow that democratic, regardless of what you thought about the government, it was a democratic, thought-through process. And I would like this generation not to think that we were baby killers and doing the things that sometimes the media and some of the movies make it out to be. Not everyone was involved in My Lai. Not everyone went and burned hooches just indiscriminately. Sometimes the media reports these things, but they don't give all of the facts that surrounded why this happened. And so I would like them to remember that they were just kids that went over there.
Is there any song that, if you heard it today, would take you back to your days in Southeast Asia?
What was it? That's a good question, because there was one that was just on the radio not too long ago that had reminded me of it. I mean, it was in the 60s, so you had all of the songs that were popular then, but I cannot remember that one that struck a chord. But it was definitely Vietnam, and it might have been on that Burns thing that was on PBS. I saw one of those segments, and that song came out, and I can't remember what it was.
Is it one of those Dylan songs?
Might have been.
Yeah.
It might well have been. Between that and Good Morning Vietnam, with that, I mean, there were all sorts of songs that just came out of that. But that can't answer that one.
That's quite all right. Well, anything else you'd like to wrap up on? Any other closing statements?
No, just that I appreciate the opportunity to, kind of tell some from the heart type stories that meant a lot to me. And again, the group that's here, I think we all have the same intention, and that is to leave a story that makes it clear that, human beings were involved in this.
Well, I can't thank you enough for taking the time to share your stories with me today. Really, it's an honor and a pleasure. But more importantly, thank you so much for your service, Reed.
Okay, thank you.